You have all had a good week. No matter how bad it was probably not as bad as what these people are going through here. We are in the middle of chapter 6. Chapter 6 is full of several different occurrences. We are in the final one that then leads into chapter 7. It's kind of all the same story. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24, we started this story about the siege of Samaria. We only got a few verses in. We're not even halfway through it. Hopefully we can get through the rest of it today. So there is some time that has passed between 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 23 and 24. We're not told exactly how much time. There seemed to be a sort of a pause in hostilities. I'm not even going to call it peace because never really held, but a pause in active hostilities, if you will. But the king of Aram, or Syria, depending on your translation, Ben-Hadad, who is still king there, we've talked about him a lot throughout this study since the time of Ahab, he has decided to mobilize his entire army to go and attack Israel. Now, in the story before that, he had been sending out bands of raiders. He had sent a contingent to go get Elisha. Now it's his entire army. 100%, every man he's got, they're going in. And they get to Samaria and they lay siege to it. Samaria, of course, being the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. If that city falls, basically Israel is going to fall. We'll all survive, but I don't know. Dasani might be a fate worse than death here. We'll see. Thank you. So Samaria is under siege, and the situation is very dire. We get details about it in verse 25. The siege is held out for so long, food is running scarce, and that is putting it very mildly. There is pretty much no food. They are spending just exorbitant amounts of money just for scraps because that's all that's left. Says we got the donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. I mean, this is nothing food for everything money, if you will. But we're going to refer back to this verse. I wanted to point it out specifically because of a detail that comes up later in the story that we didn't get to last week. So we see in verse 26, the king of Israel, who is King Joram still, I believe at this time, the second son of Ahab. King Joram, he's on the wall, and a woman cries out to him for help. She says, help me, help me. And his response is, if the Lord doesn't help you, what am I supposed to do, basically? What do you want from me? You want me to get you some food from the threshing floor, from the wine press? What am I supposed to do? What do you want? And she tells him a really just heartbreaking story about how her and another woman had come to an agreement to basically consume their own children. This is how bad the food situation is. They agreed to eat her son first, and the other woman says, we'll eat my son tomorrow. And they eat the woman's son that day, and then the next day she goes with the woman to eat the other woman's son, and the woman has hidden her son. And so she's lost her son. She's not have any other food source. This is the darkest hour, if you will, of Samaria. People don't resort to cannibalism for fun, and they don't eat their own children because there's nothing else. This is just really sad. This is really heartbreaking. And the king hears this. He tears his robes. He is in distress. He understands that this is really, really bad, that his own citizens are resorting to eating their own children. And people notice that underneath his torn robes, he's wearing sackcloth. And Joram has sort of this double-edged nature to him, which is pretty consistent with kind of what we know about him. He is in mourning, wearing sackcloth. He is, crying out, saying he can't do anything. If the Lord won't help you, what am I supposed to do? But then he also strikes back at God and is hostile toward him. And when we get to verse 31, he says, may God deal with me ever so severely if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today. instead of going to Elisha, looking for help, looking for some sort of consultation, what am I supposed to do? He says, that's it. I've had it. Let's kill Elisha. This is his fault. This is God's fault. He's going to say that later on in the story. This is God's fault. This is all because of God. And so Joram is recognizing his powerlessness, but is not in the point in his mind where he's going to God in humility. He's going to God to point fingers, which is the real tragedy of this. In the worst of situations, sometimes people can show their true character here, and he is definitely showing it. So that is about as far as we got. Verse 31. Any comments, questions, thoughts before we continue verse 32 and onward through this story? I think that was a pretty decent recap of. Okay. All right. Let us continue on. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 32, and read through chapter 7, verse 2, please.
Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. The king sent a message ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha had said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" While he was still talking to them, the messenger came down to him, and the king said, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a sheah of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 sheahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen?" One more.
Yeah,
"You will see it with your own eyes," answered Elisha, "but you will not eat any of it."
All right, thank you. So, as I kind of talked about last week, we're going to be introduced to several individuals or groups of people throughout the story, and we'll see kind of what they do along the way. So now we get to Elisha. We're making our circles here. We're now to Elisha, and what is he doing? Yeah, he's sitting around with the elders. I don't think that this is him just being lazy and doing nothing. I'm sure there's a lot of prayer and meditation going on. I'm sure there's discussion. But he's with the elders, and I assume this is the elders of Samaria. My understanding is his homestead that he's at is in Samaria. I don't think he's out anywhere else. Otherwise, how does anyone get to him past the siege lines? So I think we're all in Samaria here. I think this is all in the same area in the city. And I'm sure there is some discussion going on with the elders of the city, talking about what the situation is. I don't think this is them just sitting around. I know that the wording is kind of almost could indicate that, but I think there is work being done between Elisha and the elders of Samaria. And the king of Israel has sent a messenger to him, and Elisha knows that he's coming. Obviously, God reveals it to him that this messenger is inbound, and Elisha has them kind of block the door, bar the door, don't let them in, don't let them through. It gets a little confusing to me because by verse 33, it says the messenger comes up, is there, but then it seems at some point we get the king is being interjected here, so he must have been right behind him, kind of what Elisha was saying. So we have sort of this messenger probably shows up first, is not granted entry, then the king comes in behind him after this. And remember, what did Joram say he was going to do to Elisha? He was going to cut his head off. So he's going. It sounds like he gets there in person at some point here during the verses that were read, and he's not messing around. He actually is going there. He's not just saying things. So a couple details that I want to point out. during Elisha's instructions to bar the door, and this, I want to bring this up because your translations will vary on this, and I don't want there to be a bunch of confusion. Not that I don't think we'll have any, but it might read differently depending on your translation. If we look at the translations like the King James, New King James, in verse, where is it? I lost it in my notes. Verse 32, Elisha refers to Joram, I believe he's talking about. He refers to Joram as the son of a murderer. But in other translations, it will say this murderer. Just doesn't say son of murder, just calls him murderer. So depending on how your translation puts it, you might interpret what Elisha's saying a little bit differently. But I think either way, it's going to hold true. I don't think it's going to really affect anything in our story here. But if you have the King James translation saying son of a murderer and maybe some other translations, obviously he is the second son of Ahab, who caused a lot of problems, including, if it is referring to him specifically, perhaps the death of Naboth. But if we just look at if other translations are maybe more correct, just calling him a murderer, calling Joram the murderer, I mean, he is on his warpath to kill Elisha here. I mean, that is his intent of being at the house of Elisha. So I don't see an issue with it either way. I mean, you'll look at it maybe a little differently, but I don't see a problem with it per se. Again, I'm not a scribe. I don't know the differences here on why some are translated a little differently than others, but I just wanted to point that out. And verse 33, we have the messenger, we have the declaration from King Joram, and this declaration from King Joram, he says, this disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? Again, I'm talking about this two-sidedness, this double-edgedness of Joram. He recognizes God. He recognizes the power of God, and now he is blaming God for all of his problems. Now, we kind of mentioned this, I think, a little bit last week. He's decided to kill Elisha rather than consult him, and this is really actually ironic. You think about Joram as king of Israel. Has he been a great king? Has he been a faithful king to the Lord? No, that is not the description we get of him at any point. Now, he will occasionally get help from Elisha. He will occasionally, walk with the Lord for a little bit as long as it's convenient for him. He'll acknowledge God when things are going well, referencing the story we had before, the blinded Arameans. He's very respectful to Elisha. He calls him father, very, very respectful tone. And now he's here at his doorstep trying to kill him because things are going badly now. This is Joram. This is his nature. You probably know people who are like this. When things are good, they're great to be around. And then when things are bad, you don't want to be around them because they act like this. Joram's probably under a lot of stress. I'm not saying this should be a cakewalk for him, but he's lost faith in God here. He's saying, this is God's fault. Why should I wait on God any longer? It's not doing me any good. But of course, he's not even a faithful king to begin with, so I'm not sure what he's expecting here. There's a little bit of irony in there that I think is lost on Joram himself. Elisha replies with a very, very detailed reply, considering the next day, by this time tomorrow, there's going to be all this food, and it's going to sell for not very much, because there's going to be such an abundance. And we see here, we're in chapter 7 now, chapter 7, verse 1. It's just a continuation of this story. He says, a seah of flour will sell for a shekel, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria, which if you compare that to chapter 6, verse 25, where they're paying 80 shekels of silver for a donkey set, a quarter of a calf for a seed pods for 5 shekels, basically nothing or they're paying everything for just about nothing as far as food. And here he's saying the complete opposite. There's going to be so much, it's going to be so cheap, and I'm not an economist, but if I saw that market change in one day, I'd be like, okay, something big happened. We're going to get there. We will see what happens. But there is an objector here. We're introduced to another person. Like I said, there's a lot of parties here. We are introduced to someone who we're not given a name, but we're told who he is. he's described as an officer whose arm the king was leaning on. Or your translations may move that a little bit differently, the wording, but that's basically what he is. Which leads to a few questions. The biggest one to me, and why was he not named? Why didn't we just get his name? I don't think the name is important here. We're going to know who he is through this story. But why is Joram leaning on this officer's arm? I think is an interesting question to think about, which you may read through that and think nothing of it, but I love these little details because think about King Joram himself. He is not an aged king. He is not old. As far as we know, does not have any physical afflictions that he needs to lean upon someone to stand up or to do whatever to stay standing or help him get around. We don't have any description of that when it comes to King Joram. So why is he leaning on this officer's arm? What would be the purpose of that? Now that there could be, this is just the guy that anytime he's riding his chariot, if he's sitting down, this is the guy he grabs to stand up, and that may just be a post that they have. But another thought I had is thinking back to 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 30, we know that Joram had sackcloth underneath his robes, right? So he is in some state of mourning. Could it be possible that in addition to that sackcloth, another thing that was commonly done was to fast? Now, if you're fasting, you don't have a lot of nutrition, your body is tired, you're not very stable, you might want somebody to lean your arm upon. Now, this could be, he's fasting, out of, some sort of somberness, some sort of humility, but maybe it's just there's not any food, and even the king is not getting much of anything. I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. We're not going to know for sure. I am going into suppositions here, but it is interesting that we get this detail that he needs somebody to lean upon, or at least has someone as that for his post, which seems not necessary for a man of Joram's age and, as far as we know, perfectly fine physical stature. So, an interesting thing, if nothing else. Just a thought. But this officer who we're introduced to, he pretty much scoffs at Elisha's statement, like, how can this be? This doesn't make any sense. Maybe he's an economist. I don't know. I don't get that from the reading, but he says, even with God opening the floodgates, there's no way that this would happen. So he, in a way, he's kind of limiting the power of God here, which, if you ever get into that mind space, be very careful, because you're probably wrong. He is trying to limit what God can do here in his own mind. He scoffs at this statement, says it's impossible. Elisha responds to him specifically, saying, this is going to happen. You are going to see it. You're not going to have any of that food. And we're going to see how that plays out by the end of this chapter. This is not something that's going to happen, years away. This is like literally going to happen in 24 hours from now. So we'll see how that ends up at the end of 2 Kings chapter 7. Comments, thoughts, questions up through verse 2 of chapter 7.
One thing I thought about when I read that verse is when it mentioned Elijah that the king leaned on. And the way he speaks up right here, I almost looked at it as it was one of his advisors or something. He's being pretty bold speaking up in the middle of this conversation between the king and Elisha.
Yeah, he's definitely interjecting himself in this conversation where he doesn't necessarily need to, and is probably, when you're a lower rank than the other two, to just kind of jump in there can be a dangerous thing to do. Even, I think, in that culture would be a disrespectful thing to do in some cases. So, yeah, he's really, I think this is because the officer feels so strongly about what Elisha said that he is opening his mouth here, which maybe not the wisest thing to do. We're not exactly sure what this guy's role is. NIV uses the term officer, which is so generalized. Like, is it a military officer? Is it, an administrative officer? Is he an economist? I don't know. But definitely someone who the king had close by, the king trusted because he was with him. He was leaning on him. He trusted him enough to trust him not to let him topple over. So we're not sure, but he was definitely somebody of some kind of importance to the king, that the king required him to be there. Any other thoughts? Very good. Jeff?
It's great that the
Shah.
That's a different, Elisha.
Yeah.
That's a different reaction than King Joram had. So, and this shows how people react to trials and difficulties. When you hit bottom, what do? You become bitter against God. That's what King Joram did. Or do you say, there's nowhere else to turn, I must turn to God? And that's where, if you're truly converted to Jesus, that's where you have to be, the latter. You have to reach the point at which you say, there's nowhere else to turn but God. I must do this. It doesn't matter what my old friends think about me. This is something I have to do. So they're sitting with Elijah to see
Sure.
perhaps, Elisha, to see if perhaps some new message from God might come to give them some direction and some hope. And so there's no point in being anywhere else. This is where they want to be, and that's a good thing. Joram's just ready to come take his head off.
Yeah, and you bring up kind of an interesting idea there, because these elders, I assume these are the elders of Samaria. That's, I think, the context. They are with Elisha, as you said, Elisha. Don't worry, I make that mistake all the time. They're with Elisha. They're in with his house. I'm sure there's conversations, there's prayers, there's trying to get a hold of what's going on. Remember back in chapter 6, and we talked about this last week, Joram, he's doing work too, but he's up on the walls. He's up on the ramparts, and I think he's working, I think. I'm not, saying that he's just taking a nice leisurely stroll and is ignoring what's going on around him. I think he's probably observing, what are the siege lines looking at the enemy? How's our fortifications? How are our own soldiers doing? He's doing work, and he's kind of addressing the physical natures of things. And he has absolutely neglected the spiritual nature of what the situation is. Because, as you said, he's not looking to God for help. He's looking to God to point a finger at, and then looking to Elisha not to consult, but to kill. So he definitely knows he's in a bad situation, but he's handling it in a very different manner than the elders are. So, yeah, that's a good contrast, I think, to look at. Very good.
Also, the idea of the son of a murderer is another way that expression is used. Jesus called the people who opposed him the sons of those who persecuted the prophets.
Murder the prophets, yeah.
And they were not, they might have been related, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. Not talking about their biological relation. He's talking about the fact that you're doing what they did.
Yeah.
In Ephesians 2, we are called the sons of disobedience when we do like the world does, even though we won't have any biological relation.
Or when Jesus calls them the son of the devil.
Yeah.
That's a perfectly valid interpretation. Is the nature of the actions that they're taking make them like this kind of person, or they're following in those ways, almost kind of like as a disciple sort of thing.
And I don't know what the Hebrew text says.
Yeah, no, I don't.
So,
I don't know
it's
either.
not one way or the other to say one is right and one is wrong, but still, there's a reason for that expression sometimes.
Yeah, and that may be part of the discrepancy there for why some translations are doing it a little bit differently than others. That's something I want to look at more in my own time. That's an interesting thought. Thank you. I like that.
Another thing that's good is a shia is 9 quarts. So they'll have, and a shekel is like a penny.
Yeah.
We think of as a penny. Everybody has lots of them. So tomorrow, this time, 9 quarts of fine flour, not just coarse flour, fine flour is going to be a penny. And the 18 quarts of barley flour is going to be a penny. That's dirt cheap.
Yeah.
So you can see how he reacts to that. So he could not believe it. And one more thing is, so this expression, on whose hand the king leaned, I've read it so much, I suspect that it's an ancient expression for like what we would say the right-hand man.
Yeah, it could be. Like it was one of the things I thought of is maybe it's a position that he holds, that he's to the right hand.
The go-to guy for the king when he wants something done.
Yeah.
Take care of this.
It could be. Yeah, I'm not sure. And then this is why I say I'm in supposition territory, because I don't know, because the way the text is written, it's not necessarily always clear to us if it's speaking somewhat figuratively or if it's talking about an actual very physical thing that is happening at that moment. It's not a phrase that we've seen often in our study here. I think this is the first time in our study we've seen this phrase come up. So
Well, get the idea of this expression, on whose hand the king leaned. It's own
Yeah.
lean on, so it's kind of.
He trusts him. Yeah. Yeah. Again, that's why I say, I'm not really sure, but it's several different ways we could look at it. However we look at it, though, in that case, this officer, this advisor, is definitely one that the king had on standby for a reason. He was trusted. He knew he could be with him, and now this officer is speaking out of turn, perhaps. So, very good. Any other comments through verse 2? Go ahead, Arnold. Yeah, he's got a station. Yeah.
And he may be one of many, but it's just his turn.
Yeah.
He's just in the room this time.
Yeah. Again, we don't get a lot. We don't even know his name. We don't have a lot of details about this individual, but he's kind of going to be made an example of by the end of this chapter. I think that's why he's included here, is sort of a cautionary tale, if you will, with this individual, this officer here. Very good. Okay, well, let's move on. We got a little bit more time. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 3 through 9. 3 through 9.
Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall only die." And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise no one was there. For the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. So they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us." Therefore they arose and fled at twilight, and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, and they fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent and ate and drank, and carried from it silver and gold and clothing, and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent, and carried some from there also, and went and hid it. Then they said to one another, "We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household."
Okay. So we're introduced to another group here. Like I said, there's a lot of parties involved in this story. We have 4 men of leprosy, and they are hanging out at the entrance to the city gate, to the entrance to Samaria. First question is, what are these guys doing here? Why are they at the entrance to the gate of Samaria?
They have to stay separate from people in general.
Right. So they probably would not be allowed to enter the city because they have leprosy. You're not supposed to be around people. You're supposed to be out, kind of exiled away from, spread the disease to someone else. They are observing the 6 feet away rule, and then some. So why are they sitting at the gate? Obviously, they can't go in the city. Why are they sitting there right in front of the city? Why are they not somewhere else? Why have they... Right, because the siege. They can't go anywhere else. They're stuck. The Aramean army has surrounded the city of Samaria. They can't go anywhere else. So I'm sure if they had the ability to, they would have left. And guess what? They're hungry just like everyone else. And they have this, there's sort of, we would call this sort of game theory or working through the logic of the situation is, okay, there's no food in the city. So even if we got in the city, we'd still probably die. If we stay here, we're going to definitely starve and we're going to die. If we go and surrender to the Arameans, they might kill us, but they might also take us alive if we surrender. Let's just, it's the only shot we got. Let's just go and surrender to the Arameans. Maybe they'll spare us. Maybe we will live after all. They're looking at it pretty logically. I understand the mindset they have here. So they decide to do that. They go over to the Aramean camp. to go surrender themselves to it. Now it says they show up there at the edge of the camp at dusk, and they see that there's nobody there, not a single person. Now, verse 6, we're told in verse 6 how God's intervention in the situation is unfolding here. We kind of get a little bit of background as to why no one is there. The Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of a great army of chariots and horses. So the Arameans abandoned their camp and fled, thinking that the armies of the Hittites and the Egyptians had been hired by the Israelites to go attack them. Now, we're not told that they saw anything, but they heard something. And this may be a lost science on some of us. Sound can travel a long way away, and depending on the terrain, sometimes you're going to hear something before you see it. We're not exactly sure what the terrain was or how they were able to hear so far out and thinking, oh, there's a great army. There is obviously some miraculous thing going on here with God causing this to happen. But I think what the Arameans are doing is not God causing them to have fear. I think they're just afraid because they hear this sound. They flee. They leave behind everything: tents, horses, donkeys, food, drink, silver, gold, clothes. These are all mentioned throughout this little tidbit of all the things that they have left behind. And the men with leprosy, they go into a tent. They find the food. They find the drink. They start eating and drinking. They find supplies. They take what they find. They stash it. And then I think their conscience comes upon them here. And, they could have just kept on doing what they were doing, kept it to themselves. But again, these are very logical guys. They come to this conclusion that, hey, we're not doing right here. There's sort of the morality part is, this should be shared with all of Israel. This is a great day for Israel. But also, hey, if we don't say anything now, we might get found out later and punished. So let's not be punished. Let's go ahead and share it. So they're looking at it both a morality way and a logic side of it. And this is what they choose to do. They choose to say, well, let's let the royal path know. Let's let them know what's happened to this Aramean camp. It's a very interesting group of guys that we're introduced to here. Any thoughts, comments on these guys or what they've done or what God has done to the Aramean camp here? Okay, we're going to move on. We might finish. Someone read for us chapter 7, verses 10 through 15, please. 10 through 15.
So they went and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, we went to the Assyrian camp, and surprisingly, no one was there, not a human sound, only horses and donkeys tied and the tents intact. And the gatekeepers called out, and they told it to the king's household inside. Then the king arose in the night and said to his servants, let me now tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry, therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city. And one of the servants answered and said, please let several men take 5 of the remaining horses which are left in the city. Look, they may either become like all the multitude of Israel that are left in it, or indeed I say they may become like all the multitude of Israel left from those who are consumed. So let us send them and see. Therefore they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them in the direction of the Syrian army, saying, go and see. And they went out, and they went after them to the Jordan. And indeed all the road was full of garments and weapons which the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned and told the king.
Okay, so the men with leprosy, they tell the gatekeepers of Samaria about the Aramean camp, how it's deserted, and they in turn report it to the palace. The news reaches the king and his officers. So the king, he hears this, and what's his response? Is it a great day? Hey, everything's good now? Yeah, he has a very different response to this. And again, he's sort of in his own headspace, very different to probably a lot of us, especially since we've read how the story ends. He thinks this is a ruse. This is a trick here. They've, quote unquote, abandoned a camp thinking that we're going to come out, then they're going to surround us, they're going to take us and capture us, and they're going to take the city, and we're all going to suffer. That'll be the end of it. So he is not keen on sending out his men to go to this camp or let any of this happen. So, and this is not strategically, this is not an invalid concern. He knows there's been a great army hanging out somewhere in the countryside, and why would they just leave? That doesn't make sense. In a little way, I understand where he is coming from, but then again, he's also kind of forgotten God here in the picture, which is sort of his undoing a lot of times. Is he's got ideas, but then he forgets how God works in different ways than how he thinks. Arnold, you have your hand up. I'll go to you real quick.
Yes, I believe the men that came with the news, they were sort of suspect from the beginning. I mean, you got men that are ill coming in telling you something like that.
Yeah.
You better
Telling you something pretty incredible. Yeah. Telling some stories.
cautious about
Sure, yeah. But luckily, Joram has an officer who is pretty smart, and I don't think this is the same officer as before. He's not described the same way. He basically says, let's send out some scouts. If we just keep them in, they're going to die anyway. If we send them out and they die, what's the difference, basically? Let's have them see what's actually happened. And Joram agrees to this, and they send him out, and they travel as far as the Jordan River, finding the whole road just strewn with clothing and equipment that they had abandoned. And this is, reported back to the king like, hey, it really is abandoned. There's really no Arameans here. There is no danger, in essence. So any comments, thoughts up through verse 15? James.
On that verse 15, I have a question that's lingering in my mind.
Go ahead.
Back in verse 8, it says, and these lepers came into the outskirts of the camp, and they went into one tent, and they ate, and they drank, and they carried from it silver and gold and clothing, and they went and hid them. And then they came back and entered another tent and carried some from there also, and they went and they hid it. Then they said one another, we did not do right. This is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. My question is, so these guys went and they found some food and some money, I guess, or some values, and they took it and they hid it. These lepers did. And then they came back to themselves and said, hey, we just did wrong. After they had done wrong, they just went back to the king and told them what they had did, or they just went and told them, hey, we were wrong for this, or?
So it seems, it's two things. One is, I think I kind of talked about this a little bit, but their conscience is caught up with them. They see that there's a great bounty here,
Right.
and they're keeping it all to themselves, which, when you have an entire city that is starving, really is not something you should keep to yourself, because this should be for everybody. And I kind of actually think about this a little bit in, I forget the name of the guy, but it was during the fall of Jericho. Some of y'all can help me out. There was an individual that took some of the spoils when he was not supposed to and hid it in his tent. Achan, that's right. Okay. Achan, yeah. Achan sinned. And so he had taken something that wasn't for him, and he had hidden it just for him, not to share with anybody else. In fact, they were told not to do any of that in the first place from God. But his conscience did not catch up with him until after he was found out. I wonder if maybe these lepers were thinking about that story, thinking, hey, we've taken some things of great value, and we've hidden it from the rest of the people, and everyone else is suffering, and they will continue to suffer because of us if we don't say anything. So they have decided, we need to do things. We need to do things right. And we could kind of, knock them on the back of the head and say, well, why were you doing that in the first place? But I think they should also be commended because they figure out, hey, there's something going on here that is not just for us; it's for the entire people. And they also talk about the fear of punishment, but also I think they want to do right. We don't know much about these men. We don't know what their morality stance was beforehand, but they seem to have figured it out. They know something miraculous has probably happened here. An army doesn't just leave for no reason and leave behind all these goods. So I would give them, a little bit of a pause here because in essence, they may have saved some lives because now everyone in Samaria is going to have access to this plunder. Did I answer the question? Okay. All right. Anything else through verse 15? I'm going to try to finish it out. Okay. Let's finish it out. Someone read for me verses 16 through 20, please.
Then the people went out and plundered the tents of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the officer on whose hand he leaned to take charge of the gate. But the people trampled him in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. So it happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel. Shall be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. Then that officer had answered the man of God and said, Now look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he said, In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died.
Okay. So this is the part of the story where I like to call it, this is the I told you so verses. So we get to the end here. The people of Israel go out, they plunder the camp of the Arameans, and guess what? Flour and barley is abundant, and the price is set exactly what Elisha said it would be. Maybe Elisha is the great economist here, because this is exactly what Elisha said would happen back in verse 1 of this chapter. And we also see here the officer that was first mentioned in verse 2. He's trampled on by the people. I imagine there's a great rush of people getting through. Why he specifically was the one that died from this, maybe providence of God in a way here. Anyway, he sees it happen. He doesn't get to eat any of it, just like Elisha said would happen. So, as I said, this is sort of a cautionary tale, considering that this officer who had thought that there was something that God couldn't do, that God was limited in some way, that there was no way God could make something happen, and he suffers, he dies because of, I'm not sure I would call it necessarily hubris, but certainly blasphemy. So there's your cautionary tale there. Everything ends happily ever after. Samaria is saved. The people have food to eat. The Aramean army is gone. Not going to be any more problems in Samaria ever again, right? No, that's not how it's going to work. But at least for the time being, the people of Samaria will continue on. But, well, if any of you know the story of the northern kingdom of Israel, it doesn't necessarily get much better. But for a time, they have a brief reprieve here. Thoughts, comments, questions on this chapter before we close out for today? Jeff, go ahead.
You know, Syria is trying to take things from Israel. I mean, that's a given here. The whole army going to take things from Israel. And the law in Moses is that if you steal from a person, you have to pay back fourfold. So when you try to steal from someone and you get caught, you wind up losing, and he gets some of your stuff. And that's kind of what happened here. The Israelites, from whom Aram tried to steal these things, wind up getting the things. And of course, I know that technically, I guess these things are booty that they had picked up along the way from small villages, but at least the city of Samaria is enriched in a
Yeah.
way.
Well, some of it they may have brought with them. Their horses and donkeys, a lot of their equipment probably came from Syria. But yeah, some of the gold and silver, some of the clothing, maybe they did pick up as they were traveling to Samaria, looting as they went. It's a detail we don't get in this story, but something I kind of mentioned as a possibility, I think, last week. Anyway, we're going to stop there. Next week, we will start chapter 8. Go ahead and read through it if you haven't already. We're going to see some familiar faces come back. We're going to see some people we haven't seen in a while. Some really interesting kind of who's who stories of people coming back into the spotlight for a moment. Some prophecies that were made way back when, during Elijah's time, are going to come to fruition here. We're going to talk about a couple of the kings of Judah briefly. And then And we won't get through all of that next week, but when we get through chapter 8, chapter 9, we're going to start talking about Jehu, and that's when things get real in Israel for a time. Jehu is an extremely interesting character. We're going to be talking about him a lot when we get to chapter 9, but chapter 8's got some really interesting things that I think we can kind of look at and see how God is really, things he's talked about way, way back when, or things that happened, in our study earlier are coming up again. It's really interesting to see how God works in a lot of these things. So we'll start chapter 8 next week, and we'll get as far as we can get. So.